All right, Tim, what do you think of the idea of upgrading straight to 4K if you have an older CPU like the 47 at 90K? I've seen the data where when paired with a 3080, you only lose about 5 to 15 FPS depending on the game. 1% lows are also only affected by 5 to 15 FPS when compared to a 3080 on a modern CPU. Is it a good route to go if you want to save money and upgrade to 4K without upgrading the rest of the system? So basically, we're talking about here, most games are pretty GPU limited, but I always find these questions, and I imagine this one was pretty upvoted, was why you picked
Yeah.
it. A lot of people always ask about the 4K gaming, but I always find these questions a bit interesting because it goes about it in a bit of a weird way. So I guess we're talking about the upgrading thing here. The CPU and the motherboard, the CPU particularly, is quite an important component to ensure smooth gameplay, an enjoyable experience all around, and just generally good computing. Like if you want to maybe do some productivity or whatever. I guess what I'm getting at here is we're talking about gaming, aren't we? So we're not really talking 60 hertz panels. So
No.
if you want a high refresh rate 4K panel, which is what you'd be investing in if you're going there with an RTX 3080.
Yeah, if you're upgrading to 4K today, I would not recommend a 60 hertz monitor.
Absolutely
You should
not
be
for
going,
gaming.
yeah, 144
Even for
hertz.
productivity, 60 hertz kind of sucks. But so I guess the point I'm about to make is this: the CPU and motherboard combo is the absolute cheapest part of that entire upgrade process. So why skimp on it? So what would you say? Let's say 28-inch 4K 144 hertz panel. Where do they generally start?
You're looking at like minimum $600 US, I'd
For a
say.
decent
For
panel?
a decent one.
Okay.
One that I'd recommend. But even then, that's kind of like almost the minimum level.
Okay.
For,
Well, let's
for
just
a good
let's just
quality
go with
one.
that figure now. So $600 there. RTX 3080s, $800 US. I think the
I think at
latest
the moment, yeah, around
pricing
that.
update.
Yep.
So is it $250 for a Ryzen 7 5700X, and then an entry, not even entry level, like a decent B550 motherboard that can support like 12 core CPUs quite comfortably? They're like $100. So let's say $350.
Yep.
So that's less than half the price of the GPU, and it's roughly half the price of a decent, well, an entry level monitor, really, what we're talking about, an entry level 4K gaming monitor. So if you're investing all that money, why use the CPU? And I guess, and I don't really know in the context here, like 5 to 15 FPS, 1% lows. If you're talking about, because you're going to 4K, you're probably going for around 60 FPS anyway, some instances 80, 90. 15 FPS drop of 1% lows there, that can be like up to 20%. Or if you're going below 60 FPS, more than that. So that's quite a substantial performance loss. And it's also how much those 1% lows fluctuate as well as to how noticeable stuttering and stuff like that is. The 4790K, I would be limiting that to an entry-level CPU with entry-level hardware for an entry-level gaming experience. I think I wanted to say mad. I don't want to disrespect the person that made this comment. I guess they're asking the question, but having tested all myself, I think it's a bit of a mad combo to go with an RTX 3080 with such an old Core i7 processor that it's really very entry level in 2022.
It's a real min-max system, isn't it?
Very much so.
min-max. Like you're looking at like below Core i3.
You've got older USB standards. M.2 drives, I don't believe were thought of at the time.
Yeah, and I think we'll start to see games over the next couple of years use more and more CPU resources because we're kind of at the point where the sort of typical CPU that a person has in their system is a lot better than a 4790K. So even if you're playing at 4K and you're expecting a lot of GPU limitations, things like ray tracing can increase your CPU load, which I believe is a question that's coming up later in the Q&A. We've got, potentially Unreal Engine 5, which appears to have a lot more CPU intensive things that can be enabled in that engine. So if you're thinking right now with your extremely min-max setup that most of the load's going to be on the GPU, if you're doing this big upgrade and in a couple of years the CPU is getting slaughtered by games even at 4K, you're going to be regretting it a bit.
Do you think better advice would be, so 1440p high refresh rate, what price are you looking at there for a good quality monitor?
Oh, you can get one for like $250, $300.
So a good quality one, $300.
Yeah, for like half the price of 4K.
So I think, given that information, the best advice would be ignore 4K because it's not really worth it anyway. Get a good quality panel, so a better quality panel than what you would have got had you jumped up to 4K. for half as much money, and then the half as much money you save, so the $300, let's say $350, buy yourself a new CPU and motherboard, get all the new features, get much better performance, a much better overall system, and leave the 4K thing for your next monitor upgrade well down the track.
Yeah, and I think with 4K as well, you sort of, even though that like $600 is not the worst price, and they've come down a lot, I feel like if you're going to do a big 4K upgrade to high-end stuff, you're missing out on HDR there as sort of a feature, which at the moment adds another. You're almost doubling the cost again. So a 1440p, I agree, is sort of like a really good sort of intermediary point.
I think we've talked about this before, and I think the audience largely agreed, at least those who have done it. The upgrade from 1080p to 1440p is quite substantial, but the upgrade from 1440p to 4K at, say, a 30-inch size panel isn't as substantial.
Yeah, it isn't as noticeable.
It isn't as noticeable. So while it's still, I just went from I used to game exclusively at 4K. Now that I've started streaming, I've gone down to 1440p, and honestly,
it's pretty similar, isn't it?
It's pretty similar.
Yeah, that's why I was sort of thinking that a 4K HDR upgrade is kind of like that's the next big step, which at the moment is still very expensive.
And I should say, initially, I had to go down to 1080p for the first few streams because of the card I was using, and that was terrible. That was terrible. But 1440p, yeah, I don't notice a difference too much. So my advice would be, forget the 4K thing, get yourself a good quality 1440p monitor, look at Tim's reviews, and get yourself a new CPU or motherboard, and you will have spent the same amount of money, but I think you'd be much happier. Higher frame rates too.